Yo! Video games.
What up, dudes, and welcome back to the YoVideogames podcast. I'm Matt.
I'm Andrew.
And once again, thank you to all our generous patrons who've kept us going for over 400 episodes.
Yeah, if you're interested in becoming a patron at any level, please check out patreon.com/YoVideogames podcast. Dude of the week is Toten.
Thank you, Toten.
Had a different name before, but I think he's a long time dude. So thank you, dude.
Yeah,
Appreciate
all right.
you.
I know the name Toten, so.
But of course, we also have a sponsor to thank. We're talking about Manscaped, and if you missed their Black Friday deal or their Cyber Monday deal, don't worry, they have holiday deals going, I think, all the way straight through the end of the year. And of course, you can use our code for 20% off at any time. But we've got a couple of favorite recommendations from them. Now, if you're looking for stocking stuffers, Crop Preserver is the easy one to do.
Yeah, that is easy and simple.
I do that every year for like
Reviver,
my brother.
Because Reviver's the spritz.
Reviver's the spritz, but it's funnier to me to give somebody something they have to like massage into their balls.
You have to like. Well, it feels great though. I mean,
it does.
As long as you got a gentle touch for yourself. You know, the Crop Preserver is a great time.
Or maybe you're into that and you just want to be real mean to yourself. I don't know. But if you're looking for like bigger gifts, we recommend the Beard Hedger Pro, of course. Love this thing. You can adjust on the fly with a dial on the back. You don't have to switch out combs.
Thing's amazing, man. I've used it recently myself. It's
in a
incredible.
Pinch, you can use this even on your head.
I was actually showing it off. I was like, "You want to see how good this thing works?" And I was like, "Check this out." I'm like, "Look at that."
Honestly, this is probably now my favorite, all-out favorite product by Manscaped. Just because, especially if I'm traveling, like I can use it for everything. Everything's just one length on my head anyway these days.
The big one is the dial, like the thumb dial in the middle, where you don't have to take different plastic guards on and off. You don't have to like keep putting different things on to adjust the size. It does it automatically. It's great.
You can, if it's fully charged and you're like,
the charge lasts a while too.
Yeah, at least 3 or 4 trims I've found easily.
Oh, at least.
Yeah. But then of course the Lawnmower 5.0, the ultimate in ball care. As I've proven how good it is, I have shaved my head with this thing just to show that it is.
Yeah, and that thing, they've always worked, but I think with the new head on the 5.0, the roller part, like that actually lets you like really get into the crevasses, your nooks and crannies and whatever. So it actually it really helps, like if you want to like really get down and dirty, like I want a full deforestation here.
The newest head is kind of the best thing they've done. It's got the handyman razor, which I also love. Oh, I have it right here.
So I thought that was going to be and I thought that was going to be your stocking stuffer idea, because it's a great stocking stuffer.
The thing is everybody has beards these days. That's the main reason why.
What? But a lot of people are going to be like me. You're going to have a beard, but you're going to not want to have all that neck hair, and that neck hair. The handyman works really well on the neck hair. It also works really well if you just need to like trim down, your big Christmassy cheeks like I got.
The big, beautiful cheeks. But of course, if you're interested in any of them for this holiday season, giving them as gifts or maybe for yourself, a little self-care, please head over to manscaped.com. Use our code YoVG, all caps, for 20% off and free shipping worldwide. That's manscaped.com. Our code is YoVG, all caps, for 20% off and free shipping worldwide. Your balls and your face will thank you.
Yeah. So it's, again, sort of the doldrums a little bit, not like a little quiet before the storm, because the award season's already happened with Golden Joystick, and then we get the TJs and then Dice later on after that. But it wouldn't be anything if there wasn't already a little bit of controversy.
Yeah.
I think you actually already brought it up, but it kind of got bigger this week, and that all has to do with the definition of indie games. What is an indie game? Now, here's the thing.
I can solve it right now.
So can I.
Okay.
Well, actually, we'll get to that. But I guess background is, as much as I appreciate what he's trying to do, and I think he's brought his show up, I always want a disclaimer that always disclaimer, like Game Awards has actually come a long way, and I appreciate what they're trying to do. We had a whole episode where we kind of talked about like some of these nominations don't make a lot of sense. There definitely could be some huge improvements. Last year, you had a game like Sifu was in the best fighting game category, and everyone just kind of collectively like laughed and shook their head and went, "What?" This year, it's got more notoriety because I think it's something a lot more people play. It really shows you, I think how kind of at least with this stuff, like how kind of background fighting game is to a lot of people who aren't into fighting games.
Right.
Like for them, it was like, oh yeah, I guess that's not a fighting game. Now we have a best independent game, a game that's probably honestly isn't an independent game.
No.
And it's in the best indie game category, which means it took it from another actual good indie game, something like Pizza Tower. I'm just putting that out there. I know you guys are already thinking about it. So, and everyone's a lot more upset now. And I think what made this worse was that good old Jeffrey just had to open his mouth in an interview and tried to give the most neutral PR answer you could possibly human give, which I mean that's kind of like his trade is PR in a sense. And it's already kind of backfired because it's a little this feels a little cut and dry, like this is not an indie game, dude.
Well,
So,
so it's cut and dry if you're not looking at it from a marketing perspective. The term
Mhm.
indie is now used to describe a style of game.
Right, and that's what everyone's kind of upset about, and I feel like, well, they kinda got a point.
Yeah. But if you're saying from like an objective point of view, what makes a game indie? It was developed and published independently.
Yeah.
Done.
So
Easy.
that's and then my definition, like, independent means that like, it was published independently by the developer, or it is an independently owned IP,
Right.
um because there's my give right there is like, oh well, what about this, what about that, and I'll be like, okay, it's an indie game if it is an independently developed and owned IP.
Just because you start as an indie game doesn't mean you end up an indie game, by the way.
Mhm.
Like Minecraft was an indie game. There's no one in the world who would call Minecraft an indie game now,
Right,
right?
it was bought.
Right. It was
um
bought and it is now worth billions of dollars. I mean, what's Undertale?
mhm.
Undertale was an indie game, but if they talk about doing further stuff with the property, didn't Undertale like isn't there a major publisher now involved with Undertale? Because it's like it was an indie phenom.
I don't know. Well, I mean, there's definitely been publishers, and that's kind of like where that comes in. Like, oh well, someone will come in and be like, hey, I'll distribute the game on a
Devolver
physical
Digital.
media, right? Devolver or a limited run or a 505 games. But what makes them still indie in my mind is like, okay, here's where something is still independent, even if someone like 505 or Devolver publishes and distributes your game. Do they own the IP?
Right.
Was the studio owned? Were the employees, were the people who made the game, were they employees of a larger publisher? Does that larger publisher own the IP of the game they're making? And that's where I think this really gets into the whole meat and potatoes of why Dave the Diver is not an independent game. Because I mean, we could double check this now, right now, but like as far as I'm aware, it's a small studio, but they are owned by Nexon. And if and to from what I understand,
Notoriously independent Nexon.
Nexon owns
Scrappy
the
fighter
I yeah,
Nexon.
yeah, Recipe Fighter Nexon. Nexon owns the IP. They
Right.
own the IP of Dave the Diver. They own the employees. So therefore, there's nothing independent about it. If I will, I will double check this, as we speak.
So Dave the Diver
Um,
looks like an indie game. It definitely went
sure,
for an
'cause
aesthetic that is commonly used by indie developers. And I'm not even saying this to be a dick. That aesthetic is used because it is a relatively cheap aesthetic to attain a good version of, right? It also
yeah,
plays very well on mobile, which is also probably something that Nexon thinks about. But the marketing term indie is used when it's like, oh, it's a small team. It's scrappy. They're trying to like capture that. I don't know. I guess that like audience that normally is paying attention to small, 8-bit or 16-bit or the Dave the Diver aesthetic, which isn't 16-bit, but
Right.
it's got like you know a much more hand drawn isn't the term I'm looking for, but stylized. It's not trying to look like Beyond Two Souls. It's not trying to look like $1 billion piece of
Right. Yeah, exactly.
right. It's trying to look like something that'll look good on various screens, something that'll look good in 10 years.
Timeless in a
Right.
way.
Yeah, but you much like when people are screaming that Zelda should be photorealistic. Oh, what
Oof.
would a
Yeah.
photorealistic Zelda look like? Well, it would look a lot worse in 5 years than all the other Zeldas do now. Like, even take whatever your least favorite Zelda is aesthetically, it has aged better than most other games from its
Right.
time period, probably.
Yeah.
Uh, that is like that gets coined as like an indie thing because indie developers are looking at that, bang for your buck graphics.
Yeah.
That being said, you know, Minecraft only looks the way it does now because people have come to expect Minecraft to look that way as it gets updated. But Microsoft probably wants to do like a photorealistic Minecraft, probably. Like if there's some creative executive or executive at Microsoft that's all like, but what if we did? And everybody's like, no,
Well,
why?
they added like ray. Remember they did like a whole ray tracing and lighting update to Minecraft, and I was
Mhm.
remember thinking like, who cares?
Yeah,
Why?
why? But now the fake looking torch is even better looking.
Oh, it has glowing effects, whatever. But yes, Mint Rocket is a subdivision of Nexon. It was set up by Nexon,
Hmm.
so it wasn't even like they didn't even buy an indie company. They created a subdivision to make a smaller scale game, and now it is labeled as independent. So when we're going a little bit for the throat here, but it's like when Jeff says, independent can mean a lot of different things to different people, yada yada. It's like
Right.
when a billion when if Microsoft just, when they publish, say, Psychonauts 2, just like a Double Fine game, which
Hmm.
was an indie developer that they bought, that no longer makes Psychonauts 2 or anything Psychonauts or anything Double Fine produces, sorry. Anything Double Fine produces, that instantly makes it not an indie game.
Right.
It's a Microsoft game.
If you were bought by Embracer, RIP,
Oh.
but if you were bought by Embracer, it doesn't matter how indie you were before, you are no longer an indie developer.
And I think what's even worse here is from my understanding on this, Mint Rocket was started by Nexon, right? They didn't even
So
they
it's
didn't
never been an independent developer,
right. There
right?
wasn't they didn't even snatch up. They literally just created like a small company, a small subdivision of Nexon created by Nexon to make games, smaller scale games.
And
So
you
it's
guys
not
are
even
going to be our indie guys. I'm sorry, sir. This is a $1 billion company. Yeah. Yeah. You're going to be our indie guys.
yeah, and I think to me that's really where like there is no discussion here. There's no debate. There's no well, indie means different things to different people. Like your employees, your developers were employees of a billion-dollar game publisher, a multi-billion-dollar game publisher. That's who was cutting their checks. Like
Yeah.
there was nothing independent about this except I guess you could argue the way it looked.
There's this desire. I think everybody has the desire to be an independent artist, right? So I likened this to like films with originally when I first talked about this, where it's like, ah, yes, famously independent film made by Focus Features, the independent arm of Fox,
Yeah.
starring indie darlings Scarlett Johansson and Brad Pitt on a micro budget of $10 million, which, yes, is micro budget for a film starring, you know, for a Hollywood film.
Yes.
Yeah. Um, And again, not to like shit on A-listers doing indie films. That's great. A lot of the times those films wouldn't be made without those actors attached. It's mostly just saying that like that idea of, independent it has like this allure, right? In the 90s, independent film meant that,
It's underdog. It's like, oh, they
yeah,
this was like a struggle, like people with hopes and a dream, like tried their hardest to put it together, and not here's an employee of a multi-billion-dollar corporation under no threat of going under anytime soon,
it
told, hey, go make us some small thing. Okay, come
it
back with it, cool,
also
published.
it means that you're willing to overlook expectations. Like if you go and buy an indie game for $5, $10, hell, even if you spend $30 on an indie game, knowing that it was independently made and published means that you are willing to overlook expectations that you would normally have for a game, say, made by Activision, published by Activision. Um,
Right, yeah.
you are not going to hold an indie game to the same standards. You're going to hold a team of 5 dudes, scrapping together this beautiful project to the same standards you're going to hold, um, you know, just because it's on top of mind, the team that makes Time Splitters, owned by Embracer. I don't know why I'm blanking out, but like
Oh,
they're
Free Radical.
Free Radical. Yes, they're dying. It seems. I
Yeah,
love them,
they're
and
closing in about a couple weeks apparently.
I hope someone pulls it out for them. Free Radical has made several of the games that made me interested in playing games, including,
It
of
is
course,
so
Time
sad
Splitters
because
2.
the whole thing was that like they were gone, and then they got reformed, so
By
that
yeah,
so that they could bring Time Splitters back, and even that didn't get off the ground.
it, it, that is a whole other bummer of a story. But you're going to hold Free Radical to a different standard, especially knowing they're owned by Embracer Group, than you're going to hold the guys who made Limbo.
I mean, and another good example would be like if it ever comes out, Perfect Dark,
Right.
the reboot of Perfect Dark, because Microsoft started a brand new studio to make that game, even though they're not even like they may not even be the leads anymore. But their whole hiring spree said make the world's first quadruple A game.
Right.
So
Not going to be an indie game.
no, I mean, granted, now that's a project where they expected to have a lot of people on it making it. So the
Right.
whole idea is that like, well, Dave the Diver is a subdivision and it's a very tiny studio, and they made the game somewhat quickly, in a couple of years or whatever, right? And I'm like, the size of a team does not denote whether it is independent or not.
Right. You're
Like
not going to call Mario an independent game, the first Mario, or even what
yeah,
is it, the first 4 Marios. You're not going to call any of those independent games. But if you read about how big the teams were back then, you'd be like,
right, exactly. And in a more recent example, okay, is WarioWare games, okay? Like
"Ah,
WarioWare games, for all intents and purposes, mostly look like Flash games. Like they have like 3D polygons in them now or whatever, right? But like they're mostly Flash games. They're party games. They're get you and your friends together, get drunk, and try to like out outperform, win, whatever,
out
right?
dickhead."
Out, exactly.
Yeah.
But like look at the presentation and whatever of a WarioWare game, and it's like obviously not art goes into it, and obviously some coding and programming goes into it, but it's not a massive project. It's mostly 2D graphics. It's mostly being real here. It mostly looks like Flash animation. It looks like Adult Swim stuff. That's what
Right.
WarioWare games look like. They are not independent games
Just
because
because they look that way. Yeah.
right. And the funny thing is a lot of recent WarioWare games are made by Intelligent Systems, which is a company that is not actually owned by Nintendo. They're just completely in bed with them because they make Fire Emblem and other
Hmm.
things and Paper Mario. They are not actually owned. The company itself is not owned by Nintendo. They're just in the same building and they basically always work together. Always have, right? But here's the thing. Nintendo paid for the game. Nintendo owns the IP. It doesn't even but like there is more claim to say WarioWare Move It or the last one, Get It Together on Switch being an indie game because Well, the developer who made the game technically isn't owned by Nintendo, but that doesn't matter because, well, it's a Nintendo IP. It's a Nintendo funded game.
Yeah.
You know, like and here's other good ones. There's games people don't remember exist, like Box Boy and Pushmo, maybe even Dylan's Rolling Western or whatever.
I don't remember any of these.
These are all small 2D, sometimes 3D, but like Box Boy is such a good example. It's this little action puzzler game. You play as a little 2D box, and you basically like fit yourself into, nooks and crannies or whatever. It's made by HAL Laboratories, who makes Kirby games, right? So
Mhm.
HAL's not owned by Nintendo technically. And it's this little 2D game that I think came out on the 3DS maybe. And then there was like Snipper Clips as well, which is also a game not,
Oh my god, Snipper Clips.
it's a Nintendo published game for the Switch. Nintendo doesn't technically own the studio, but no one sat there and thought Box Boy or Snipper Clips, or Push Mode, indie game. Yes. Yeah, it's just a little 2D game. Of course it's independent. No, it's Nintendo funded and published this. No one
Right.
in their right mind would say that. And it almost, and here's and I kind of want to I think getting off this part of it, Jeff kind of tried to deflect in his follow up to that comment, saying that hey, I don't make the nominations. We just have a panel of 120 outlets, and I'm like, this is your problem, Jeff. Your panel of 120. And this is what I've argued, because it's not necessarily Jeff's bought and paid for. Jeff does this. Like, Jeff isn't everything. Yes,
Right.
TJ is his baby, but Jeff is not everything, right? And he deflected of this, and he's not necessarily wrong, but it's like, yes, this is the game that came back from the outlets that said they put this in their category for best independent game. What Jeff does have the power to do, since he is the owner runner of this thing, is to go, that's not an independent game, that doesn't qualify. Now, he could have done that before, and he has done that. Like, I'll let you in on a little insider here. Sometimes they will get feedback when the award season comes and be like, hey, I'm just letting you know this will not be eligible for that. It doesn't fall into this definite, like, that is in the guidelines for the judges when they nominate games.
Right.
So Dave the Diver slipped out of that. Like, they, for whatever reason, it just wasn't in. Nobody thought about it when it came time to pick the nominees, not even the winner, just the nominees. So that just slipped out of there. And then he got the nominees, and he looked at it and went, yeah, okay, this is fine. And he probably didn't put much thought into it at all personally. Now he's getting pushback for it, and I mean, things have already been set in motion anyways. But like, again, there's a point where the buck stops there, and he definitely had a opportunity, multiple, both when he, before any nominations came back in, to say, hey, let me clarify what independent is here. To sort of sit there and say, like, well, independent can mean different things to different people, and I leave it to the judges. That's kind of like saying, well, they could come back with anything then if you're not going to stop it. The thing is, there has been areas where he said this is not eligible, this is eligible. He has a cutoff date, right? And where he says, this is your cutoff date, any game released after this point can't be. And then Sony comes back and says, but God of War, and he goes, well, okay, well, if the press can get a hold of it before the cutoff date, regardless of the public, then it'll still be eligible. Okay, like, so there has been back and forth on eligibility for titles with the judges, between him and the judges, and so
In a
this
in an
fell through the
industry that
cracks somehow.
has exploded the way that the game industry has exploded. And again, I relate this back to film, but because it's the same is true of the Academy. When the Academy first started, and maybe perhaps when game journalists were first tapped to be the ones deciding what would go to the Game Awards, although it's a much smaller timeline for the Game Awards, you probably had a bigger pool of people who genuinely loved and were steeped in the culture of games
Mm-hmm.
in the Academy's, movies. But as time has gone on and these industries have gotten bigger, The fact of the matter is probably most game journalists working in, game media and stuff didn't come they didn't go to that job specifically because they loved games. They went to that job because they had a journalism degree and that job was
Mm,
hiring, or they had a video degree. Like IGN hires video producers all the time,
right.
that they want to be like one man bands that know everything there is to know about video production. Very few of those guys that can do that one man banding probably are as steeped in gaming culture. They're in video and film culture.
Right.
That's what they love.
Because like I said, when like LA Times is one of the judges panels.
Right. And the thing is I'm not trying to trash any of those media. What I'm saying is that like the standards change when the people setting the
Yeah.
standards aren't people who really are steeped in the culture
But
or give
let's
a
be
shit.
real here. They're absolutely at fault here because again, the nominees are decided by the judges panel,
Yeah.
like all the
Oh
120
yeah,
media
yeah,
outlets,
yeah.
and he said that straight up. So they're just as much at fault here as anyone for basically going, yeah, Dave the Diver, that's an indie game. These are the people whose job it is to report on and review and do all the basically critique and
Right.
whatever video gaming, and they're sitting there like, yeah, Dave the Diver, that's indie. There's part of me that's like, is this just straight ignorance? They're like, who made it? Oh, Mint Rocket. Okay, cool, sure. Nobody double checked who Mint Rocket is.
Can I like I'm gonna deep end you for just a second. But there's this thing in journalism generally that has happened in the last 20 years where like think of the like blue collar journalist of the 70s and 80s. The guy who like he had a high school diploma, maybe he went to college for writing, but like he went and got a job working the crime beat, your David Simon if you will, because that was the blue collar journalist thing. And okay, he won a Pulitzer or he moved into whatever, but then in the early 2000s all the journalists were people who went to school for writing journalism, right? And all these people came from upper middle class,
Right,
uh,
yeah.
who just sort of accepted the way things are. They
Mm,
weren't investigative by nature. I'm not saying this
right.
is true of all journalists, but it is sort of funny the idea that journalism in the last 20 years especially has become a bunch of people like, well, the cops said that, so I guess that's true. Whereas like David Simon, who wrote The Wire, based entirely around cops are just as full of shit as criminals sometimes.
Right.
Like the cops would be like, yeah, this is what's happening on the streets of Baltimore. And then David Simon would go and find a drug dealer and be like, hey, what's happening on the streets of Baltimore? And he would like investigate what's actually happening, right?
Well, it reminds me a lot of what happened last year. Remember
Right.
when the whole Bayonetta thing blew up, where the actress comes out and says this accusatory thing,
Right.
and then the publishers are like, "Well, that's not really true," like or they're silent, and so everyone is just kind of like pitchforks at the ready. So Jason Schreier goes in and he starts talking to people, and they're like, "Okay, so here's what really happened. Like, she actually got paid like way more." And then the whole thing where it
Right.
came out that like that low ball number was for her to come in and say like three lines, and she, that's what she's blowing up about.
Hey, yeah, and I mean, for whatever you think of Schreier, he is sort of the only actual investigative journalist in
Yeah,
gaming.
yeah, and I'll give a shout out to the Did You Know Gaming crew. They're not necessarily doing modern day investigative journalism, but they have done investigative stuff into basically stuff way in the past, 20 years ago, whatever. Like they've gone in and dug in and
Right.
gotten, words and statements and even artwork from canceled projects from a long time ago that like
But
Nintendo definitely didn't want you to see.
they're not like a media backed. Isn't Did You Know Gaming just like a YouTube only?
I mean, I think they're part of like a crew, like or like like I don't want to say conglomerate. Like some like how like Yo Video Games we are part of
Right,
like
right, right,
like
right. Okay.
it's like a thing like that where it's like a whole like a co-op I guess
Right,
of
but
other
Schreier's Bloomberg.
Cyrus Bloomberg.
Right. I'm not trying to say like, oh, he's a real journalist compared to Did You Know, but what I mean is like an
One is
independent investigative journalist is different than like
Right.
you know,
So here we are now. We're talking about the difference between
yes,
an independent investigator, an independent journalist, and a non-independent journalist. So
right. I guess what I'm getting at with that is like there's a lot of platforms that are the judges for this that they see the minigame and they never look beyond step 2.
and that's the thing too, is that
Like, oh, it's a team of 5. That's an
but
indie.
everyone does that too, where it's like, okay, like I can't remember her name, like whatever, like comes out, makes a video saying they were only going to pay me, this much money for my work, which is like, wow, that's really low. And I was like, well, it's not like, well, it's not entirely unheard of, but yeah, it's kind of low. But then like the numbers she's touting what the IP is worth is way beyond what it is. And then someone does some digging around and goes, oh no, 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 not at all. That's actually not actually. That is a truth being stretched. But every outlet ran with it saying, wow, Nintendo really lowballed, like, or
Right.
so and so didn't like really pays their actors this badly. And I'm like, well, that's not actually true. But
I don't think anyone went after Nintendo specifically. They were going after
some did.
Platinum.
And a lot of people went out of Platinum. And I'm like, they're not
Yeah.
even the ones who fund the game. Like,
Because Nintendo writes checks for a lot of the people that write these articles. Like that's just true. A lot of gaming journalism is funded almost entirely by the companies that they are
well,
writing about,
here's the thing about like
advertising from.
and this is, I mean, again, I've kind of been out of the journalism side of the gaming media side of this, in that it's not even necessarily checks. It's kind of like coverage, like
Access. Yeah.
access. Yes, like there is a sort of, you write this about us, you will not hear from us again, kind of thing.
Right. And so I don't think anybody really went after Nintendo with any real gusto. They did go after Platinum because Platinum doesn't really get a say on which
Right, and
media gets
they're
access,
not owned by anyone. I mean,
Right.
yet, but like so.
That being said, like I'm not trying to like shit on game journalists because I know we have in the past, we have like, you know, really sort of taken them to task for whatever reason. But that's not even what I'm trying to do here. I'm just saying like they don't have an incentive necessarily to dig in and find out if that was an actual indie,
Right,
and
and a big reason for this is that no, like here's the
it's
saddest part here.
confusing on purpose.
Nobody cares either.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
the thing is like our audience listening absolutely is going to be interested in this conversation we're having about Dave the Diver and indie publishing and what is and isn't an indie published game, right?
Right.
Our audience definitely will. But like Joe Schmo six pack who plays Call of Duty, who in Madden, the vast majority of the casual video gaming audience who's going to, who will casually watch Game Awards, they don't even know or care about this.
Right. They'll see a headline and be like, "Oh, the game's good indie game."
So
Like, yeah,
you might
it's fair.
yeah. So then you might ask, well, why bother then if nobody cares? Why even make a stink about this if it does? Because I'm like, and I think that kind of falls in the point of like, well, it's kind of the job of the people who are running the award show and voting in the award show, like the judge panel. It's kind of their job to sort of be that educator in a way, because they have like, who's the content creator of the year? They have a games for change category where
Right.
they highlight games, that have like a strong message or a strong, thing. Like they have like, their job is to highlight when something good is going on or when something like this is happening, or to highlight in on all sense, like because they have two indie awards, debut and in just regular independent game. The whole point of this is to highlight, here's a really cool independent game you probably didn't hear of because it didn't come from a multi-billion-dollar company,
Right.
except
And
except this one actually did.
did, yeah. Really, what you expect from a game journalist is discernment. They're supposed to be educated and in the know so that they can tell the common person who's perusing looking for a really good indie game. You're really just interested in playing a good indie game, and this person's like, "Hey, it's a good indie game." Now, granted, Dave the Diver might be good. Like, it
Mhm.
might be very good. I'm not trying to trash Dave the Diver, and I don't think anybody should take away from that game being good by it not being indie.
Mhm.
That's fine. I'm just saying that like the judges should know better. That's really kind
Yeah.
of the whole point of this. And like, oh, why care about it? Is like, well, the whole point of the show, the podcast, is like it's our hobby to dig in and care about it. How many like how many video game podcasts are run entirely by two people who are enthusiastically involved in gaming? How many are owned by IGN or whatever to do marketing material? There's a lot of gaming podcasts, so there's probably a good amount of both. But my point is like that's the reason that it's a deal. It's a big deal, is because you want to know the difference between marketing material and actual, you know, taste,
and it's kind
discerning
of,
taste.
I mean, honestly, it's kind of got a sting if you are, say, an indie developer and you release an independent game
Right.
that you own, and it gets real for whoever reviews it, they get gets really critically acclaimed, but it had struggles to find an audience. And then here comes the Game Awards and nominates a game developed and published by a multi-billion-dollar corporation in Korea, and it might walk away with the indie award.
Right.
And it's like,
And that
I can't
incentivizes
win. It's like,
other big multi-billion-dollar corporations to get into the indie space.
because here's the
You know,
thing is that it's gonna sell, maybe a couple, like winning an award at the Game Awards, like best independent game, will probably sell a couple thousand extra copies of that game.
yeah.
Probably.
Hopefully,
Like
hopefully
it's
there is a reason to strive
it's
to
it's
be.
it's gonna cause a sales boost somewhere, and
Yeah.
probably more for winning best independent game will probably cause way more sales than, say, winning best soundtrack, like or sound design even. Like,
Mhm.
hey, I'm not happy necessarily about that, but like I'm gonna be real with you, like 16 was probably gonna walk away with the best soundtrack award. I don't think that's gonna do much for 16 sales.
Yeah, I
Like
don't
sitting
think
there, oh,
16 is going
Final,
to see any
like,
boosts
oh,
from
Final
this.
Fantasy 16 had a really good soundtrack. I guess I should go buy it now. It's like, no one's gonna be swayed by that. Everyone knows it has a good soundtrack, like kind of thing. So, but like, best independent game is a game you probably didn't hear. I mean, like, oh, this is really good. I should, maybe I'll go check it out. How much is it? Oh, it's like $20. Oh, $10, whatever. Oh, yeah, I'll go get it. I'll
Yeah,
get it
I'll
on
go check it
Steam,
out.
whatever. I'll go check it out. It's because it's such, and indie games are usually such low investment, low cost. So,
And the thing about this is there's a lot of truly indie games that get a lot of attention and you wouldn't necessarily know they're indie games. Uh, I pulled up like a small list of it, but like Hades, for example, was independently developed and then published, wasn't it? Before
yeah, like it's
Devolver, I
independently
think.
owned and published.
Yeah, that's right. It is. Yeah, it's Devolver's not even involved. Um, the point is like you can have a really big game. By our own definition, I guess technically Rockstar Games independently develops and publishes
No,
its
they're
own
owned by
stuff.
Take-Two Interactive.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right. They're owned by a bigger company. But my point is it's not that, an indie game has to be a scrappy team that has no money behind it
Yeah,
necessarily.
it's not even it's not about the money, and it's not about the graphics. To me,
Right.
independent means you own the IP, you self-published it. And I'm even willing to like look the other way on self-publishing if you own the IP. An example of this is Shantae, right? The original Shantae was published on the Game Boy Color by Capcom. None of the other games have ever been published by Capcom because Capcom never owned it.
Hmm.
Shantae is copywritten to Matt Bozon. It's not even Way Forward. It's the literal a literal guy. His wife
Cool.
created it, and he submitted the copyright form claim or whatever. You will see copyright Matt Bozon on every Shantae game.
Oh yeah.
So it's an independent game, and they've funded the development themselves, which I mean makes it even I think drives the point home even more. Like, I think an independent game should be is arguably like a self-funded, but I don't even know if that's necessarily true. I just say, like, if you own the IP, this is an independent IP. This is not an IP owned by any company. If you own it, and someone comes in, like a Cuphead situation where Studio MDHR owns Cuphead and it's being made independently, and then Microsoft comes in and says, hey, we'll give you some money and help you finish the game, but we wanted to come out on Xbox first. Is Cuphead an indie game? Kind of. They because the thing is, they still at least own their creation.
Yeah.
Microsoft didn't buy Cuphead, but they did kind of help publish it. And the thing is, I don't think Cuphead was ever brought up at any independent game categories in 2017. I mean, I might be wrong about that, but like in 2017, I don't think Cuphead was up for any indie awards because everyone knew Microsoft threw money at it,
Right.
even when they didn't own it or the studio.
There's an aspect of this that I think is also important that we haven't really talked about is like the democratizing power of the internet. The reason why it's important to identify and correctly identify independent games is that, there is
I will
through
correct my
digital.
statement. Cuphead won best independent game in 2017 at the Game Awards.
Oof.
I will correct my statement there.
Um,
But again, you can still argue that Microsoft didn't own the IP,
right.
and they didn't start development on it, and they didn't fund the entire thing.
So the reason that I would argue that this is even more important is that an indie developer that owns the IP that funds the development, and then now there's more opportunity than ever to self-publish, self-distribute. Um, it's becomes that much harder if they're now competing in the indie space with billion-dollar companies because those billion-dollar companies can flood. They're taking away one of the only avenues that an indie developer can stand out
And
by saying, "No, wait, I'm independent."
well, that's the other
Um,
thing too, is that when you see this stuff, you see at Microsoft's press conferences, here's Cuphead, here's Ori technically. I think actually they own Ori though, but here's Silk Song, right? There was like a year ago, a year and a half ago at the Microsoft press, like would be E3 thing,
mhm,
right? They had a big trailer of all the games coming to Game Pass, and Silk Song was on there. They don't own Silk Song, they don't own the company. But what does that do though? Is that they're advertising on one of the biggest venues, hey, here's an independent game that's going to be on our service,
right.
which that immediately puts that in front of all these other independent games who just didn't get chosen by the claw of of media dominance to be shown in front of millions, hundreds of thousands or millions of eyes.
Right, and a
So
lot of indie games is where interesting ideas come from.
right,
Independent film, independent anything is where usually where the interesting ideas are because interesting ideas nobody wants to bet on. Nobody
right,
wants to take a chance
because
on an interesting idea.
and that's the thing, is that gaming, like films, I feel like identically to films right now, is kind of like really just high stakes gambling. It's a casino where the people running these major studios and running these major publishers, they look at their projects as bets. They are
Right,
chips on a table. Okay, and they're basically, they're gonna try to, they always try to do the safest possible bet because everything's a bet. And Disney will be the first to tell you this year, nothing nothing's a guarantee anymore.
well,
So
I as an aside, I think one of the biggest problems that has hit film and is only now starting to hit gaming, is that executives in film no longer care about films. There's very few especially around the early 2000s. Before the early 2000s, if you were an executive in film, you weren't some guy who was also an executive in tech or an executive at a
mm,
bank or an executive. You were a film executive. You had a very specific skill set and interest in being an executive of films.
right, and then
Uh,
people would usually, when one, because like I mean I go back, Eisner, when he came in with Disney in the 80s, where did he come from? Paramount.
right.
Like they went
Uh,
from one to the other. It wasn't kind of just like, who's this guy? Like, oh, I ran Discovery Channel or something and
nobody,
made
nobody
made that a
involved,
lot of money.
nobody involved in any of this type of pursuit wants to make a bad thing. Generally speaking, they don't. Nobody that's making games wants to make a bad game.
Right, and that's what I always tell, because I always say, like, I hate the term lazy dev. Well, this
Right.
developer's lazy. I'm like, no developer's lazy, because making anything in gaming is hard. And also,
Right.
nobody set out to make a bad game. All the people who made Golem, as much of a you know buster cluck that was, in the development hell it went through, and all the other bad decisions that are coming out about it. Nobody making the game thought, let's make a really terrible
Right.
Lord of the Rings game.
However, the CEO of Embracer Group doesn't care about making good games.
No, because it doesn't come from game development. It comes from frickin' retail.
He cares about making games that sell whether or not they are good. Now, you could argue that only good games sell. I would argue that's not true, but
No, it's
uh,
not true.
it's the same with like movies. Why is Disney doing so bad right now? Well, Disney hasn't been in the game of making good movies in years.
Mm.
The people in charge of making movies from say like Feige down, they're all in the business of making good movies. But the people who give Feige money, or Iger, for instance, Bob Iger is not in the business of making good movies. He doesn't care if the movies are good so long as they're selling. He's in the business of selling movies. He doesn't give a shit how good the movies are. He doesn't
Right.
even really care what awards those movies win beyond will it make for more sales
Will it
on
make more
future
sales?
films. M-
And you can tell
This
that
is a change.
immediately.
This is a
Yeah.
change that happened that in the early 2000s, even still, there was this idea. Studio heads had an idea of one for me, one for them. We make a movie we know will sell because it's a safe IP, it's based on a book, whatever. And I will go and fund a couple of very cheap lower end movies that have interesting ideas by filmmakers I love from abroad. I mean, there's tons of filmmakers. Luc Besson only got the career he has today because there were producers interested in making his small or funny French films like The Professional. Like The
Yeah.
Professional only exists. Gary Oldman was only in The Professional because a studio head somewhere was all like, "Oh, I really like Luc Besson films. I'm going to take a chance on him." And we have enough of safe to float it.
Yeah, but he's a pederast.
Beyond all that, I'm just choosing him
But I
because
get
he
what
is
you're
now one of the
saying.
biggest dudes.
I get what you're saying.
It-
Although that last film I think flopped spectacularly.
he's had a lot of. I would also argue that Luc Besson isn't necessarily in the business of making good films anymore. He is now in the business of selling films. He has been for a long time.
Yeah.
Um, Guy Ritchie is another example I could use, right? Like the reason Guy Ritchie has the career he has today is because a studio executive saw one of his smaller independent films and decided to make Snatch with him,
Hmm.
right? Brad Pitt saw Guy Ritchie's movies and was like, "Hell yeah, I want to be in Snatch." Like that's uh
And
it's
honestly, it almost feels like this is where sometimes it almost feels like actors make better decisions on finding film projects than the studios do, whose job it is to do that, right? I recently read a thing where uh, Denis Villeneuve's next film, I forget what it's called. It's going to be this hard sci-fi,
about time and space.
time and space. Who's the producer? Who's funding it? Morgan Freeman. I don't even think
Interesting.
Morgan Freeman's even in the project. He just was like, there was like this opportunity to get. He basically came on board to like get the book rights or whatever rights for
He's a
the. I think it was a
handshake. He's a handshake producer.
get the
Yeah.
deal going, get it get it set in stone.
Hmm.
So Denis Villeneuve is going to make the movie Arrival on steroids because an actor was like, yes, let's do that kind of thing.
Ad Astra is a perfect example of like it was a film that only got funded and made because Brad Pitt cared about making a hard sci-fi.
It pivoted a little bit into video games. I wish we saw more of this. Do you remember when King Kong was coming out? Peter Jackson specifically went to Ubisoft and said, "Get me the guy who made Beyond Good and Evil."
Hmm.
He's like, "I want the guy who made," which was Michael Ansel. He's like, I want the Beyond Good and Evil guy. I want the Beyond Good and Evil team to make a King Kong game because I don't want just a shitty King Kong game. I want a game from that." And the King Kong game comes out, and it's actually good.
Right.
It's actually one of the better like movie-based games.
Michael
So
Ansel, R.I.P. He's dead to us. Um, gone forever, gone and not forgotten.
but it's like, okay, I wish we saw more of that in gaming where like someone was like, "Oh, we kind of need," and it's
Well,
funny how like sometimes this does happen in gaming where like an independent studio technically sort of has to play hardball, and I will bring up Next Level Games now. They're a little independent Vancouver studio, and I think they had other projects or other small things, but the thing is they made a game for Nintendo that sold 4 million, and then they followed up with a sequel that sold 11 million copies. And then they're like, "Hey, we can't keep our lights on necessarily. We're going to sell ourselves. We're putting ourselves up for sale."
mhm.
So they basically, I can't believe this worked for them, but like they literally pulled this gambit, and Nintendo bit and was like, "All right, fine, we'll buy you."
Hell
So
yeah.
they bought a studio, and a Western studio at that, because they had made Luigi's Mansion 2 and 3, and we're like, well, times are tough. We're putting ourselves up for sale, because and Nintendo's
And
like, crap.
and the best way to sell yourself always is talent. But one thing that is true about games that's different than like other entertainment industries is, and we've talked about this in like the auteurs episode, the game industry goes out of its way to make sure you don't know who's making the game.
Yes.
They really
Yes, they do.
fight.
And I'm going to shit on Nintendo, because like everyone was saying, like, why did Nintendo hide the developer of Mario RPG remake for so long? Why did Nintendo hide the new voice actors for Mario and Luigi for so long? Why are they going out of their way to hide it? I don't get them. Like, oh, this is their MO, guys.
They want you
This
to
is
think about game developers and game directors as technicians, not artists.
right. Like, this has been the MO of the
Right.
whole industry for a while, especially in Japan. Like, say, fawn over the country all you want, but they're more adamant about you not knowing who makes what in Japan
Well,
than even the Western studios tend to be.
do you know who's taking a page out of that playbook? Hollywood. They are doing everything that, especially over the last 20 years, they don't want movie stars anymore. They don't want them. They don't want to
No.
have to negotiate based on how valuable your screen, presence is. They want directors to be technicians, not auteurs anymore. They are doing everything they can to make they want the producer's name to not even necessarily mean anything anymore. They don't like I argue that they don't like that Feige or Kennedy or they don't like that these producers have followings, that people go, oh, if Feige's involved, it's probably going to be good. They don't like that. They don't want that. They want you to go, oh, it's Disney. That's what they want. They want you
Yeah,
to have loyalty
they
and brand
want
recognition to
brand.
Disney.
They
Right.
want brand because they want to get that, because that mind share existed, frankly, in the movie industry for decades.
Right.
And it existed, and it's already existed. It existed in the game industry for the first couple of decades as well. Like, nobody sat there and said, "Oh, Miyamoto, what a great creative person." Nobody really thought about who Miyamoto was until the N64 era.
Well, I would argue that really it's Kojima was the guy who made it sort of cool to.
Well, and he was, and I'll say it straight up, like, he's the one who started putting his name on the front of the box. Like,
Right.
he was starting to push. Now, you could say, like it was kind of selfishly in a way, where it's like, because if he was only the producer, he just put produced by Kojima, but wouldn't put the director of said game or whatever. And you can get into the debate about that in person, one way or the other. But it's just, the point of the matter is
Tim
that,
Burton.
oh yeah, he absolutely, like, he Tim Burton Zone of the Enders.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Damn it, Tim Burton and your Doc Martens.
So yeah, it's just one of those weird things. We're not even weird things. It's just one of those things where, like, he was pushing to put name recognition behind something.
And God, did they hate him for it? They
Oh
really
yeah,
didn't
they
like it.
absolutely did, and eventually they got rid of him for it. Not for that necessarily one thing, but like where does it end up? Like, with him gone, kind of thing. And Metal Gear Solid Delta will have no names on its box.
I think something that's interesting about, like, especially since YouTube has gained prominence, um, everything has become about having a brand. Like, whether you're a content creator or, well, that's really what it is. Companies want content now. They don't want art. They talk about
Right, and
content as a product.
I said this, I think, in our review or of Boy and the Heron. It's like, that was a film. Disney doesn't make, what has happened to them, because they actually had a huge flop this week, and it was
Wish,
like,
yeah.
yeah, I'm like, what, like, they don't, I'm like, they don't make movies anymore. They make
Product.
product
Yeah.
to fill content. They make product so that it can fill a content quota on a service somewhere else.
And take heart, because this happens. I would say this happens probably every 20 years in the film industry, and
Absolutely, yeah.
probably
You can literally, like, check mark when it happened. Disney, where was Disney at like its low, like some of its lowest point? Well, right in the early '80s.
Mhm.
That was the point when Don Bluth had his big split, and Disney was suffering real hard. They had that black hole flop. Tron flopped. The original people were like, Tron flopped when it first came out.
Yeah.
So the early to mid 80s, Disney was at this super low point, and they came back in 89 really with like Little Mermaid, right? And then Disney went through this huge downturn in the early 2000s when
Yeah.
they left traditional animation. It was bombing left and right, like, and they tried to do some early CG, and they had really terrible films like Chicken Little. I don't care who you are, that film sucks. Um, so
How dare you?
so early 80s, early 2000s, early 2022s.
I think that the game industry is going to mirror this moving forward, especially because all of if it's going the same direction as the film industry has always been a boom and bust industry.
Mm.
TV was stable but couldn't compete with the film industry in terms of like the scale of things being made. But now TV is going through its first real bust because it left the stable model behind to go for streaming's boom and bust
Mhm.
model. Uh, I think games are probably going to go that way. And so you're going to see indie games have this boom and bust. You're going to see this idea of like
Yeah.
companies, especially if, you know, like this idea of, oh, Nexon can have an indie studio.
Yeah, and I
Like,
think that's the real dangerous precedent this is setting,
right.
where
And
it's like,
you're going to it's going to murder actual independent developers.
right.
They'll get pushed out because no one's going to want to bet on them. Well,
And
Nexon's
everyone
got
says,
its
well, you
indie.
know, the cream will rise to the top or whatever, the cream of the crop or whatever. And
Mhm.
I'm like, that's not necessarily true sometimes. Like sometimes it's just if whatever catches on, because there's even games that like they'll be out for a couple years. Okay, Among Us
Mhm.
came out and did nothing. And for years it did nothing. And then suddenly someone found it, picked it up, and it became a huge success for the developer.
Yeah.
And you know, like that you know, you can't count on that happening with anything, you know. And it doesn't help, you know, if something keeps getting drowned out. You know, like you know, who made Among Us devs billionaires? People like us.
Yeah, content creators.
Content
Uh,
creators, not just word of mouth, but people who streamed it or played it or talked about it. They're like,
that's
"Oh, there's this thing I heard about." Oh, just and they, you know,
interesting aside of a game developer who was all like, "I don't want to pay YouTubers to
oh
play my
yeah,
game."
we didn't even talk about that guy who kind of nuked his own project, and then there was like
Yeah,
another guy who was like, please don't don't boycott this game. Like, you know, I totally don't
yeah.
agree with what this guy said, and I worked really hard on it.
I think the spirit of what he was saying though was that he was just saying he felt dirty paying someone to play his game. You know, rather than he didn't look at it like marketing, he looked like bribing. And it's like, well, but you do that for any of the journalism
But I mean, that's what all the
outlets.
publishers do.
Right. That's right. It's like
So
it's just
like
marketing budget, dude.
don't
Um,
don't hate the player, hate the game. Like I think that in that instance right there, I was like, that it's just simply boiled down to, man, you know, don't hate, don't go hating the players, hate the game.
right.
This is the game industry set up. This is how you play it.
So to end out the episode, I wanted to look at like some I pulled up a list of indie games that got, you know, published over the last 10 years or so. And I wanted to talk about some of the the ones that like really might not be viewed as an independent game. Uh, you know, even though we know for a fact that they're Vampire Survivors took
Vampire
off,
Survivors.
has a very indie style, was a very small team. But like maybe something like Shovel Knight. Shovel Knight was very popular.
They
People
were
really
industry
loved it.
veterans, but they went and started their own company, you
Right.
know, kind of out of their house eventually, and then eventually had a very small studio and made it on their own and published it on their own. And they own it.
Undertale, you know, was a zeitgeist game for a long
Yeah.
like how much that was in the culture. This is something that indies can do easier, believe it or not, than the big ass games. They can become I don't want to say memes because it's not what I mean, but they can become memes. They can become cultural touchstones
Yes.
for everything else.
The
You're gonna
DNA
have
of the soul.
right. You're going to have huge games that reference some bullshit in Undertale because the developers on those big games saw or played Undertale when they were coming up, that kind of thing, and we're like, oh, we're going to make a reference to this. Like that's going to be the cult classics. Indie games are way more likely to be cult following games than anything else. Hollow Knight, obviously. Cuphead to an extent, but Cuphead, like we saw, had a lot of Microsoft money behind it, and maybe that should have been
at least advertising.
Yeah, and maybe we should have called that out. Maybe that was
we know that like they did have to like mortgage their home or whatever,
yes.
to keep the funding going on it, because it was in development for a while before like Microsoft put some like money into it to sort of like keep the project going, make the project bigger actually.
You have games like Inside and Limbo. You have games like Ikaruga, which I don't know if you remember that. That got onto
Treasure game.
360. Yeah, didn't that get on 360? That's
Mhm.
years and years ago.
Years ago. It started as a Dreamcast game, then it got a GameCube version, and then it got, I think the
Xbox
360 arcade, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And then Amnesia spawned an entire genre of horror games.
Or
Or
style, like
style, I guess, would
I
be
mean,
the
if it and shoot, I mean, you can see right into Resident Evil.
right. It would
It changed the game even for the granddaddy of them all.
some might say it infected the genre because some people really hate how Amnesia does stuff. Hades obviously took the world by storm and
Hades is
caused,
not the first roguelite, whatever. I don't know
but it
what it
definitely
is.
roguelite. Yeah, no, but it made it a thing again.
But you know what it did do? It introduced it to a whole lot more people.
Dude, The Binding of Isaac from
Right.
2011. Yeah, huge.
Anything by Behemoth Games, Alien Hominid,
Castle
Castle
Crashers, yeah.
I don't know about BitBlock Theater as much, but whatever.
I didn't know Rocket League was an independent game. It says it is.
Yes.
Psyonix, developed and published by Psyonix. Rocket League, huge touchstone. So that's really the reason why this is important. You're talking about indie games, indie films, independently made art or entertainment of any type tends to become the cultural touch points for all mass produced whatever. Look at how many YouTubers have made the jump to full-time filmmakers.
Yeah.
Wasn't Shazam the first Shazam movie was directed by a YouTuber, like a YouTube filmmaker?
Was it? Oh man,
Yeah,
it might have been.
I think so.
Might have been. And I think
Maybe I'm misremembering, but I think
Street Fighter's going that way. They're making an actual Street Fighter film by people who made a really cool Street Fighter YouTube video. That's happening. That's happening right now. But I think really in the future, if any award show, not just but every award show, I'll make it real simple for you. An independent game, independently funded and owned, both. Just say it has to have both. You want to be like real, critical about this. Just say like it can't, it can't even be. It can't even have Microsoft money. So like it would disqualify necessarily Cuphead 1, like the first one, because whatever studio MDHR does in the future, I'm sure they're going to be able to self-fund on their own. They self-funded the DLC. But yeah, just in the future, just say an independent game has to be independently funded with no publisher source. But then I know that gets into a bit of a quagmire. But like, well, what if a movie studio or just a philanthropist, a billionaire, floats the money to them? It gets a little murky, but just say that like it can't have any major gaming publisher. It has to be self-published, self-owned, like self-funded, self-owned. Maybe not even self-published. Like at least like you could just say self-published, self-owned.
Yeah.
Like and I know that will cut out certain other independent games, but I mean if you just limit it to like they self-published it, they self-own it. No one else. There is no other corporation tied to the ownership of said game. The publisher is the developer, is the benefactor, is the owner.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I can agree with that.
Like
I always, again, I come at this stuff from a film perspective, and it's like it's very uncommon for you to get distributed without selling the rights to the.
Right, which is why I'm like, well, I mean, okay, here's the thing. Like, well, we're talking about independent. Like, it's independent.
Yeah.
Independent should mean independently owned, independently published.
Yeah.
It's like, and that's the thing is like, well, they could everyone, because that's the argument here is like, well, what is this? What about this? What about that? I'm like, make a rule set and stick to it, because we're just seeing here's the reality of what happens when you don't have a clear definition going in. You end up with a multi-billion-dollar company creating a subdivision with their own money, and then employees of that multi-billion-dollar company making a video game
Mhm.
and releasing that video game, and then that video game, because it looks 2D, being declared independent and being up for the best independent award when it has no right to be.
And once you make the standard definition, it's okay to have gray area games that you can debate about, but you can't have a gray area if there's no standard to judge things by.
Yeah.
There's no conversation if there is no standard. To end on, I'm not full of shit. It is David F. Sandberg. Has been a filmmaker since 2006, but he gained most of his following with like online animated short films, um, like on YouTube and stuff, and that got him his feature film stuff. But he made Lights Out, Annabelle Creation, Shazam, and Shazam: Fury of the Gods. Swedish filmmaker. So the point is that like independent art has real impact in the world, and I would argue more impact than your commercial films. Not every case, right? Spielberg, I don't think Spielberg ever was an indie. I think he was in the studio system from day one.
Even that oh god, I'm forgetting the name of the movie, the truck movie.
Right, that was a studio film though, right?
I don't remember. It was made for TV, but I think it was studio funded.
Yeah.
Gosh, I can't remember the name of it. It's his first film. And it's about like a psychotic truck driver that's trying to like run a dude over
Yeah,
out in SoCal.
I remember what you're talking about. But on that note, we do have patrons to thank. Of course, if you're interested in becoming a patron at any level, please check out patreon.com/YoVideogames podcast. Dude of the week was Toton. Thank you, Toton. And our producers for this episode are Mutton Chops Johnson, Screwnomi, Koroy35, Hyper Viper 89, Ziggy Z, and Online Persona. Thank you, dudes. We will catch you later.
Later, dudes.